Welcome to The Pie. I'm your host, Tess Vigland. Economists are always talking about the pie, how it grows and shrinks, how it's sliced, who gets the biggest share. In this show, we're talking about the most pressing matters of the day seen through the lens of economics. The Pie is a production of the University of Chicago's Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics. And in this episode, we're looking at the housing crisis in this country and some of the reasons why we got to this point where in large swaths of the U.S., it's tough to find an affordable place to live. In particular, we're going to explore a break in the connection between housing availability and American mobility. Historically, we've been a nation that moves around a lot, but that's changed in large part because of these housing issues. So let's get to it, but a quick note before we do. If you've only been listening to us here on The Pie, these many years, well, as of this episode, you can also watch the podcast. We're making our YouTube debut, and from here on out, you'll be able to find us both here in audio and then also on video. So I'll be doing my hair from now on. You can go and search for the Becker-Friedman Institute on YouTube and subscribe. And, well, we're here for all the options now. All right, let's get to our guests who've been patiently waiting. Let me ask you both to introduce yourselves. Peter, let's start with you.
Peter Ganong. I'm an associate professor of public policy at the Harris School at the University of Chicago. Unfortunately, I don't have any hair, so it's not possible for me to do my hair even when we are on video.
Fair enough. All right, and Yoni Appelbaum.
I'm Yoni. I'm deputy executive editor of The Atlantic and author of the new book, Stuck.
All right.
I should add that I don't know if I have a favorite kind of pie, but if you live in Chicago and you go to Michigan in the summer, you can come home with like a 10-pound box of blueberries. And so we have been making a lot of blueberry pies in our house recently. And there's still time when this episode drops. I believe there'll be a few boxes of blueberries left if you head to Michigan.
All right, that sounds delicious. Now I want some pie. All right, and by way of explanation, Yoni's book builds on some roots from Peter's research. So we've got both of them here to talk through this housing mobility issue. All right, Peter, I want to start with you and your research that goes back actually more than a decade, but that has aged well and become more and more relevant to the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. Mm-hmm. Let's get kind of a TLDR from you on those findings. But first, I actually want to hear about why this issue interested you in the first place, and it began with the first time you had to pay for your own housing.
So I graduated from college. I moved to D.C. I was a staffer for the federal government starting in 2009. And I had to pay
the
rent.
Obama administration.
For the Obama administration, yep. I was working for the White House Council of Economic Advisors. I was literally the lowest rung on the totem pole of staffers, sort of when everyone else declined a task, then it went to me. I had to rent an apartment, and I had some geographic constraints. I wanted to be relatively close to the city center. And my roommate was also a recent grad. We were on a budget. And so in the end, we rented officially a 1-bedroom unit, but we were technically, I guess you'd call it, like doubled up. So a lot of units in DC have these unheated but closed-in porches. I feel like Yoni's going to start nodding now because he's seen a lot of these apartments. They have these in Chicago too, but they're like really common in DC. And because I had more geographic constraints than my roommate, we decided that I would get the unheated porch to sleep on. My parents bought me an electric blanket. My girlfriend rarely came to the apartment, in part because of the porch. And at some point, I sort of began to wonder, like, okay, if I have a college degree, I have a good job working for the federal government, and I'm sleeping on an unheated porch, what if I needed to support a family as opposed to just supporting myself? What if I didn't have a college degree? What if I didn't have a roommate? There were 3 things working in my favor, and I was sleeping on an unheated porch. Presumably, there were a bunch of other people in DC sleeping on unheated porches. Presumably, there were in fact, I know there are people in DC with substantially lower income. How were they going to make the finances work of having a job in DC? Or would they be able to make the finances work for having a job in DC and affording housing in DC? And so that's, I think, in various policy ways, I'd thought about housing before, like I, done a lot of work in college at the local homeless shelter. But I think the reality of sleeping on an unheated porch really made me think a little bit more about like what what were the choices that everyone else was facing in the economy who was sort of less privileged than I was at that point.
Yoni, any similar experience for you?
Yeah, and I'll say, as I've talked about the book and encountered many people who are concerned about this, there is usually a moment in their own lives where they come face to face with the constraints imposed by our housing markets,
Even if they're not on a porch.
whether they're on a sleeping porch in DC, or whether they're living someplace and want to live someplace else and can't. People usually have that personal anecdote. For me, it was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was getting my doctorate in American history, and we had a kid, and we moved into an apartment that could house us, our kid, and our second kid. And we realized somewhere along the way that we were spending more than we could afford, and the place was a little smaller than we actually needed. And like Peter, I thought that this is a little bit crazy. My wife had a good job. I was teaching history. We were living in a city that for 100 years, more than 100 years, had been a landing pad. Cambridge was a working class town for most of its history, filled with factory workers. It was the factory town across the river from Boston, and I was living in what had long been a working class neighborhood, and yet instead it was filling with professionals who couldn't actually afford the housing that was there. And I thought, this is kind of crazy. Something has gone very badly wrong in a city that for so long accommodated people looking for that first rung on the ladder of opportunity, and gave them that step up. And now even people who've already achieved some degree of success in America can't afford to stay there. And I wanted, as a historian, I really wanted to know what changed here. This can't have been the way it always was, and I wanted to understand that change.
All right. So then, Peter, let's get to your research. Walk us through this relationship between income and housing costs and how that has affected American mobility. How much has that mobility declined over the decades?
So this is a paper. The title is "Why Has Regional Income Convergence in the U.S. Declined?" And I'll explain the connection in 1 second to mobility and to housing regulations. And then the other thing, just to say at the outset, is that this was joint work with Daniel Shoag, or Danny, who was first a graduate student with me and then was a professor at the Kennedy School and now teaches at Case Western University. And we started out trying to understand the following pattern. Is basically why is it for a long time in the US, poor states were catching up to rich states, and people were moving from poor states to rich states. And you can imagine how those things will go hand in hand. When a person moves from a poor state to a rich state, moves from Mississippi to New York, let's say, that's going to increase the population in New York. Wages are higher in New York. The person who moves gets this benefit from moving. And then the state also gets some economic benefits as well. So it both pushes now we do the video part, like it both pushes the states together, and it also, because people are moving from one place to another. And we tried to do a data version of putting ourselves in the shoes of different people at different points in time, in the same type of way that I was talking about with the move to DC and Yoni was talking about with moves to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so we have the following thought experiment, which I can take zero credit for. Like, this was totally Danny's idea, but I like it, and so I can share it in the paper. And it's also actually, this particular data point comes up in Yoni's book, so clearly resonated with Yoni in addition to resonating with me when Danny first came up with it. So first, think about a lawyer who's deciding to move from Mississippi to New York. And that lawyer would see about a 40% increase in their wages. That makes sense. Lawyers make more in New York than they do in Mississippi. That's true both if you just look at the raw wages, what's on your pay stub, and if you subtract out housing costs. So, pay more for housing in New York, but you get paid more in wages. And so you get a similar percent increase in your take home as you do in your pay stub. Now, instead, let's do the same thought experiment, but think about it for the janitor. So a janitor, if they moved in 1960 from Mississippi to New York, and there's a lot of technical assumptions under the hood here that I'm sweeping aside just for the sake of the story, but the details are in the paper. The janitor would have made 70% more if they moved from Mississippi to New York. So that's the type of gains from migration Yoni is going to studies in a lot of different contexts in his book, and he's going to talk about more, I hope, in a moment. And if you took into account housing costs, basically you'd find something pretty similar, which is to say you would still find that the janitor would make a lot more from moving from Mississippi to New York. If you think about that hypothetical janitor instead today, instead of in 1960, you still see a bigger paycheck in New York than you do in Mississippi, but the housing costs eat it all away. So a janitor who lives in Mississippi today should not make that move to New York. The pay stub's higher, but it's fully eaten up. In fact, actually, it's negative. A janitor in New York should move to Mississippi once you take into account the housing costs. And so, we'll talk more about some of the broader patterns in the data as the conversation goes on. But at the simplest level, it's not worth it anymore for a janitor to move to New York. And for a long time, it was worth it. And there are lots of people in America who've made those moves for economic gains. And the Great Migration as one example comes to mind. And basically, it's not that migration isn't happening anymore, but its color, its flavor, its shape, its taste are all different now than it used to be. And all of the new flavors and shapes and tastes are driven by this difference in housing costs, of much higher housing costs, not just in New York, but in many places across the country. So I'll pause there and we'll get into the data more later. But that basic lawyer versus janitor parable that Yoni picked out and sort of graciously repeated in his book, I think is really foundational for thinking about the role of housing costs in economic opportunity today.
And at its simplest, what are some of the root causes of this?
It's the regulation stupid. I think it's the simplest way I can say it. So basically, it's just really hard to build new housing in some of the places that people want to live. So there are some places where if people want to live there, they just put up a new house. And that's how you get another house. And in those places, the cost of housing is very similar to the cost of construction. I think actually there's a recent Pi episode with my UChicago colleague, Chad Syverson, that I can now give a shout out to. In some places, the cost of building matches the cost of construction. In
Right.
some places, the cost of building way, way, way exceeds the cost of construction. That difference is driven by a shadow cost where economists see a big role for housing regulation. So all of the rules and red tape that you have to jump through to maybe be allowed to build a smaller building at the end of the day than you would have built if you were just sort of able to build freely.
Okay. Now, Yoni, your book takes some of this and puts American mobility on a really long historical context, going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. I would love to hear you tell us a little bit about his migration journey.
Yeah, first though, I want to blame Peter for this because I remember the conversation where he was describing the work that he was doing with Danny. And it was a light bulb moment for me where I went from maybe the inability to build new housing is what's wrong with my city. Maybe it explains my problems to maybe this is what's wrong with my country. Then widening the lens out, I think is really, really important. And it's what I'll use Lincoln to do in a moment. But often when we have these conversations, we're thinking about the people who already live someplace. And what I really love about that thought experiment that Danny came up with is it makes us think about the people who don't get the chance to live someplace. They're not seen, they're not heard, they don't get to come to the community meetings before the zoning review board about whether or not the new project should go up. But they are the people who tend to pay the highest price for our inability to build the new housing that would extend opportunity. And so that sent me back on this journey. I thought, well, okay, if that's not working, and it did work for a long time, maybe I could go way back and figure out why Americans started moving. Because it's not something that people had done in England for the most part. There were laws against it in England that were fairly rigorously enforced. So it was the creation of a radical new American freedom that instead of communities choosing their own members, people should be able to choose their communities. That was a legal right that Americans effectively enshrined in law for the very first time, as best I can tell, in human history. And then it leads to this absolute explosion of mobility in the 19th century. as best I can calculate this, 1 in 3 Americans on average was probably moving every year by the middle of the 19th century. And the Lincolns are this great example of it, right? Where he's got one parent who descends from Virginia, the other from New England, and his dad he stakes a claim to a farm in Tennessee. The problem with Tennessee was that the land titles, you sort of like went down and you registered your deed and you said, like, I'm half a mile from the river and 2 miles south of the mountain, and some other guy says, I'm half a mile east of the oak tree and 2 miles west of the village, and like it's the same land. And so a lot of the titles were really contested. So he builds up there, which was something you can do in America. You could start over with your family and stake a claim to that land. Gets caught in a title battle over the land and has to start over. Um, Now this was part of the magic of American mobility. You could start over, right? And
Right.
instead of being tied to a single place, instead of almost everything that matters about you being heritable, your religion, your occupation, your social standing, your economic prospects, this radical freedom of human mobility allowed Americans to begin anew. So he starts in a second farm, and that one also gets locked in a title battle, uh, um, and he loses that one too. And then he goes west, and he has a farm in Indiana, and that one is like actually reasonably successful, but goes on to Illinois, and that one's a little less successful. But this peripatetic life that the Lincolns lead is both typical of the 19th century, and it also does the other thing that mobility does really, really well. It puts you in the way of opportunity. So by the time Lincoln is a young man, he is living in Illinois, and Illinois is a terrific place to be young. It is a rapidly growing state with burgeoning commercial opportunities. Lincoln makes his living as a lawyer, literally riding circuit from town to town, and that too is something where he can lean into that mobility. He moves to Springfield, where he makes his way in politics, and then eventually, of course, relocates to Washington, D.C. in pursuit of a job opportunity. Uh, um, and good housing. The housing came with the job, right down Pennsylvania Avenue from here.
Right.
And so, that's Lincoln's story. But if he grows up in Virginia or New England, where his parents were from, or at that first stop or the second or the third stop along the way, he doesn't become president. It's continually relocating in pursuit of opportunity that puts his family in the way of changing economic prospects and allows him to make his ascent.
And this expands out as the decades go on, and you write about moving day, and you say that Americans once tended to look at houses the way they now look at cars or iPhones, consumer goods to be enjoyed until the next model came within reach. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that played out on moving day and what that was?
Yeah, moving day was an institution in many cities, many rural areas. Under the common law, if the lease wasn't written, and almost no leases were, they tended to all expire on the same day. So we were a nation primarily of renters, whether tenancy on land or certainly in urban areas, and people would switch. They would, on that moving day between sunup and sundown, a third, half the residents of an urban area might swap dwellings.
A
Um,
third.
yeah,
That's a lot of people.
it's wild, right? That the cartmen are charging these usurious rates and moving as fast as they can across the city because the more runs they can get in before nightfall, the more they can make. People are piling all of their possessions on the curb, waiting, trying to flag down that cartman, rushing them up into the new apartment as the old family is moving out of that apartment. So it was this wild, chaotic scene, and reformers hated it. They kept looking at this and saying, this cannot possibly be efficient. There must be a better way to do things. And in some ways, it was very inefficient, right? And it did mean that there was a lot of disruption, a lot of disorder. There were costs associated with this. There were also real benefits. As these cities expanded their housing stock, uh, builders would rush the new units to completion to be ready in time for moving day. They tended to get snapped up by the most affluent families who could afford the brand new housing.
Mhm.
But that meant that the most affluent families in town were vacating the apartments in which they had previously been dwelling, right? Or the houses that they were selling and putting back on the market. And that meant that people could bump up one notch. You can trace these chains of moves, 10, 12, 15 moves, where one family vacates and another one bumps up. Pretty much everybody who's moving on moving day is ending up someplace better than they started.
I'm just
Because
imagining uh, wealthy people now all selling their Teslas and everyone upgrading their auto stock in the way that people used to upgrade their housing stock.
But
Right.
it's kind of what the luxury auto lease market looks like.
Yeah.
People have an 18-month lease, a 2-year lease on the car, and they trade it in for the newer model. And every couple of years, they're pleased. And back then it was like, wow, my last house had running water. This house has hot and cold running water, or it has gas heat, or it has, there were all these new amenities that you could get, but only if you were continually renewing the housing stock. So moving day was the way that Americans thought about housing. They thought about it as something where they expected to get better year by year, and to meet their needs in some way, even if it wasn't more commodious. Maybe it was closer to their place of employment. Maybe it was closer to a school for their kids. And so with each of these moves every year or two, they really expected to end up a little bit better off than they had been.
All right. So let's talk about some of the reasons behind why mobility started to stagnate. And I know, Peter, you said earlier, what did you say? It's the regulations, stupid.
You're very,
So
very smart, Tess.
I'm stealing from you. So talk to us a little bit about how and why that started to happen. NIMBYism in the 1970s, I know. How did all of this affect Americans' ability to move around, and why?
So I'm going to kick most of this question to Yoni, who will know more of the history than I will. But just to give like one sentence to kick Yoni off, if you look, which is something we do in the paper, at the amount of lawsuits that are filed related to land use cases, they're rising over the whole 1900s, but the time when they really take off is in the 1970s. And it's the places where there's a lot of litigation about land use, the same places where housing gets expensive. So almost like going back to that shadow cost we talked about before, the shadow cost is going to pay the lawyers instead of to pay for the housing. But Yoni, you should sort of jump in here because you actually will know more of this history than I will and be able to
Yeah, no,
more
I think
detail.
that's exactly right. It's a two-stage process, right? And first we get zoning laws, which are local governments regulating what you can do on your own land. And the key distinction about zoning is it says no longer are we going to regulate the things that are harmful to your neighbors on the basis of the harms. Instead, we're going to say that there's a whole bunch of things which are perfectly fine, but we're going to say they're only allowed in some places and not in other places. You're not actually hurting anyone with these things, but we just don't want you doing that over here. Uh, um, these laws have a really unfortunate history. The first one in America happens in Modesto, California, and it is a way to ghettoize the Chinese. I dug
Can
up
you
a lot
talk,
of
Yoni?
records
This
on
is like
this.
one of the best. I mean, sorry, there's a lot of good anecdotes in the book, but this is a particularly good anecdote. So can you do a little more depth on the
Yeah,
Modesto
Modesto,
laundry?
California, they are, the Chinese are in the laundry business. They're in the laundry business because they've come over, and they're driven out of most other lines of work by racist discrimination and violence. Uh, um, the laundry needs to get done, in sort of a classic Bay Area startup way. All these dudes come to California searching for gold. They don't want to do the laundry. You get a Bay Area startup. I'm not making this up. Which actually sort of their hack is to gather up people's laundry, put it on a boat to Hawaii, and in 6 weeks you can get a laundered shirt back. And that obviously was a little bit inefficient. So the Chinese spot an opportunity here. Their way to get a slice of the American dream is to do the work, pretty much the only work that they're still permitted to do because racist whites won't do it. And they get into the laundry business. So they're doing that in Modesto. And laundries are like Starbucks, right? Like you don't walk across town to get to your favorite Starbucks. You just stop at the nearest one and get your cup of coffee. And so the laundries move out into the residential neighborhoods to be closer to their customers. But that means that their proprietors are moving out into those neighborhoods too and living above the shops. And there are white people in Modesto who don't like that. But the Constitution says that you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. We have the Reconstruction Amendments by now, and the federal courts keep intervening every time California tries to ban the Chinese. And in Modesto, they hit on a really clever solution. They don't regulate where the Chinese can live. First, actually, they try vigilante violence. They all put on hoods and go through the Chinese areas, smash the windows, drag people out in the street and beat them. The Chinese rebuild. Their second solution is arson. They try burning the Chinese out of these workshops and laundries, and the Chinese rebuild. Their third solution was particularly deadly. It was zoning. They invent America's first zoning ordinance, and they say, you can only have your laundries west of the tracks and south of G Street. They pulled an old map of Modesto, and in the year they passed that ordinance, there's only one block west of the tracks and south of G Street, and it is labeled Chinatown. So it is an explicit ghettoization ordinance that never uses the word race. This is where zoning comes from. It says something is perfectly fine if you do it over here and not over there. That's the really unfortunate history of zoning. And you can tell this story in its various iterations. In New York, you get the first citywide zoning ordinance, and it is a way to push the Jews back into the Lower East Side and off away from the merchants of Fifth Avenue. And they're quite explicit about that at the time. Zoning spreads as a way to regulate population. That's the magic formula of zoning, is that the Constitution doesn't let you regulate where certain races and ethnicities live. It will, however, they discover, allow you to regulate what you can do on the land. And regulating what you can do on the land is a really good proxy for regulating who can live there. So zoning spreads, but it doesn't totally restrain American mobility. Americans are really attached to the right to mobility. It constrains it, it shapes it, and makes it less equal. But until about 1970, Americans stubbornly remain attached to moving. If 1 in 3 move in the 19th century, you still have 1 in 5 moving as late as 1970. So it's gone down, but not by that much. And then what shifts around 1970, what Peter and Danny showed so elegantly in their paper, is that people start litigating around this. And they do because the rules around litigation change. There's a legal revolution and a cultural one, which says you can challenge government decisions in court, even if you have no direct harm accruing to you from that government decision. So anyone who wants can challenge a government decision. So if zoning says what you do on your land is now subject to government approval, this 1970s legal revolution says, and anyone can challenge the government approval. And it essentially hands a pocket veto to anyone with the time, the money, and the anger to invest in blocking somebody else from building housing. And it takes a while for that to take hold. But as it does over the last 50 years, Americans simply stop building housing in the places where people most want to live.
All right. So Peter, tie this in for us to the research that you did, and talk a little bit about some of the data sets that you mentioned earlier that show exactly what happened because of all this.
Great. So let me try to take you just to me. I think I'm going to be a little bit repetitive in the name of like describing a causal chain, which sort of starts in Modesto and then really takes off in the 1970s. And then I'll go back to the data, but just the chain of events is basically that some places, not all places, but many places make it hard to build for a variety of reasons, often exclusion, often race-based exclusion, although not the only reason. And then that makes housing more expensive, because if you can't build new houses, then, if you have a place where there are good jobs, but you can't add houses, then housing prices are going to go up instead of housing quantities go up. When housing prices go up, it has a different effect for the lawyer than it does for the janitor. And the reason is very simple, and it's just math. It's that everyone needs some land to live on, no matter what the quality of the house is that you live on that land. So even if the lawyer is going to live in a nicer house in terms of, the kitchen or whatever, than the janitor, both of them need to get a piece of land to have that house on, or a piece of land to have that apartment on. And everyone's in the same land market, regardless of how nice their fixtures are inside their house. And so what that means is basically high housing prices will, eat up some of, historian Yoni and engineer spouse's salary, but it'll make it so expensive that if you're a janitor, it doesn't even make sense to move to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so what happens is you move from a world where everyone is piling in to places like New York and California and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and populations growing rapidly, to instead what we call in the paper skill sorting. for every time that Yoni moves in, not Yoni personally, but well, maybe Yoni personally. Actually, in fact, this actually comes out in the book because Yoni talks about the history of his specific housing unit. But if you fix the housing stock and lots of people want to live there, every time one educated person or one high earning person, who likely is going to be educated, moves in, one worker who's less educated or earning less is going to move out. And so you're actually going to end up chasing out workers who are earning less because they can't afford to live there. And so you end up with, sort of stuff like, there's some crazy anecdotes, which I'm sure that listeners have heard in other contexts about, just how hard it is for a firefighter or a teacher to live in Palo Alto because, there's just there's a rule you're supposed to live there, but there's no housing in San Francisco, any of these expensive cities. And so we call this skill sorting because instead of everyone piling in and sort of an open door, every time that the housing stock is fixed, every time one high earning person moves in, another low earning person is going to move out. It's all going to operate through housing prices. And so that's sort of the downstream cascade of what happens in a world where in an America, I should say, where there are some places where there are very good jobs, but there aren't enough houses for everyone who wants to live there. So that's, and it happened specifically. The one thing the paper shows is I think that before we wrote the paper, I think it was widely understood that New York was, had good jobs and had expensive housing. But I think the key thing that we focused on was that housing regulation was shaping people's migration decisions. And just to try to give like a little bit even more prior credit, like my advisor, Ed Glazer, had written a lot about the high cost of housing. And what we added was, this is so high that it's going to drive people's migration decisions. It's not just making it more expensive for New Yorkers or more expensive for people in Cambridge. It's actually changing the decision of those sort of people on the outside that Yoni talked about who are deciding where to move and whether they can afford it.
So, Yoni, explain for us what this means broadly for society. What do we lose when there is less mobility in the population? Are there any upsides?
Yeah, obviously I've moved 15 times in my life. I don't think I've ever wanted to move. Migration is usually a trade-off, and often a very painful trade-off, right? You're moving away from people you love or communities that you value, settled routines and habits, from comfortable situations in many cases, often memoirs of migration over any geographic distance are memoirs of pain and dislocation, right? So I want to acknowledge that up front, right? Like, some people really love to move. I'm not one of them. So yeah, there were things about greater residential stability that you can point to as positive. But I think that the key losses happen along maybe three different axes. One is in purely economic terms. If you are moving toward a place with greater economic opportunity, at any decade of American history you want to look at, if you match people up as best we can with similar demographic characteristics, the people who move do better economically than the people who stay. Um, and that effect is actually amplified in the second generation. The kids of the movers do even better than the kids of the people who stayed. We know this in terms of international immigration, right? That the immigrant dream story of America, where immigrants come here and they thrive. The thing that immigrants share is that 100% of them are migrants.
Right.
They've all moved.
They are moving. Yep.
And if you match up those immigrants against native-born Americans who moved to the same places at the same times, their economic trajectories are actually indistinguishable. Those Americans do just as well as the immigrants. Their kids do just as well as the kids of immigrants. The secret sauce to immigrant success in America has always been putting themselves in the way of opportunity, that with many fewer constraints, they tend to end up in the geographies where opportunity is most concentrated. So if you're not moving, you're not doing that. And as we've experienced labor shocks in America, I think we have seen over the last 50 years much more severe damage from those labor shocks, where people who are losing their jobs, who are seeing their industries displaced, used to go through the painful process of migrating someplace else. And as they've lost the ability to do that, they tend to get stuck in the places where they're living without the same kind of economic opportunities, right? So migration gives you a better life, gives your children an even better life. The inability to move from one place to another tends to retard people's economic progress and to deepen their economic pain. I think that's one axis on which you can measure this. The second, which was something that was sort of a surprise researching the book, is the social dimension. Um, what, maybe the best way to explain this is for listeners who have gone to college, a 4-year residential college. Most people look back at that 4-year experience as sort of the peak of their social lives, right? Everybody on that campus has just moved. And you arrive at freshman orientation, and
And in fact, there is usually a moving day,
yeah,
right?
there's a movement there, right? But they all come, and the whole place is sort of tuned to the fact that everybody is newly arrived. And you've got to find your world. You got to push yourself out of your comfort zone and make connections and make friends and form relationships. There's a social vibrancy that comes from migration that I think many people have experienced in their lives. And we know this empirically is true of American history. Our peak decades of migration are also the peak decades of civic vitality. When somebody is new in town, maybe you go to church for the first time in years, even if you haven't been, because you have to meet people that Sunday. Maybe you talk to the person sitting next to you at the bar. Maybe you join some kind of a social club. You're willing to push yourself and to forge those new relationships. America's civic life has atrophied over the same 50 years that we have seen this radical decrease in geographic mobility. And it's a little counterintuitive. I think people often think like, oh, all that moving around will serve as a social asset. In fact, the thing that made America such a remarkably vibrant place in terms of its associational life and its civic life was the fact that our identities were not heritable but constructed to some large extent. That you could land in a new town and make something of yourself by the connections that you are forging. That's what American individualism is.
Yeah, the new start.
Yeah, it's not like we're individualists because we're all by ourselves. We're individualists because we choose our own communities. And that new start was really, really powerful. And then the third thing that I think you can measure, so there's the economic, there's the social, there's the political. Those same 50 years are when we've experienced radical political polarization. And that is because if you're mixing people together constantly from different places and different backgrounds, you get a greater diversity of political views. Over time, people in the same settled community tend toward homogeneity in terms of their political views. And so if you cease to move, you start to reflect the views of those around you to a greater degree. You have less political diversity. Not only that, but the politics go on a really sorry trajectory. There's a great, actually, a psychology study from the University of Chicago, which looked at it, wanted to understand, like, maybe migrants are just different than the people who didn't migrate, right? So they tried to adjust for this by going and asking people about their intention to move over the next period of time. And then going back only to the people who had said they wanted to move, and seeing what the outcome was, had they moved or not, and measuring them on the same scale. What they found was that the people who moved tended to become more optimistic, more future-oriented in their thinking, more likely to see the pie, and this is my obligatory reference for the show. The pie is
Thank you.
growing and giving a larger slice to everyone. Their own success was bound up in the success of those around them and their people. But the more profound impact was on the people who had intended to move and were not able to, which is a very large number, a number which is up 50% over the same period. And those folks tended to grow more cynical, more alienated from each other and from their communities, and to see that pie as a zero-sum game. The slice that anyone else took out of it was that much less that they would have. I think you can see these trends reflected in our politics, that it is the regions of America which experience both the greatest economic dislocation and then the greatest immobility that trended furthest toward a politics of a zero-sum game. And so, the damage from not moving, I think, is really, really profound. It's economic, it's social, and it's political.
So, again, Peter, your research is going on a decade old, but it's found some renewal in the so-called abundance agenda, the YIMBY movement. What does that tell you about your original findings, and does this surprise you at all?
I, unfortunately, am here to be a little bit of a Cassandra. So, on one hand, you might have thought, the attention to the research and this, citations and the books, the politicians endorsing abundance. Every state has some new pro-housing law. You might think that the tide is the tide has turned. And the only place that I can tell that the tide has turned definitely is the think tanks.
Hmm.
Meaning, like, it's pretty easy to convince a left-wing or right-wing think tank that there's a staff member or, author that there's too much housing. It's also been pretty easy, frankly, to get people on the Hill to say things, or in the executive, even going back to George Bush administration, you can always get people in government to say that there's too much housing regulation and that this is a barrier to opportunity. And that's been, was in the Obama administration under Jason Furman. The Biden administration did this. Ben Carson under Trump was talking about this, Bush I mentioned. But on the ground, it's actually quite bleak. And so I in advance of like prepping for today, and we're sort of coming up on the sort of 10-year anniversary of the paper soon, I pulled some more statistics to prep for today, and it's pretty bleak. So let me just give you a little bit of that flavor of why I say that it's bleak. So California is building very little housing. California is building a lot less housing than it was in the housing boom in the mid-2000s. This is in spite of the fact that California has, on paper, been a vanguard of legislative reform. So California, for example, authorized accessible dwelling units, which is basically when you put up a small unit, it's usually a studio
The
or one
granny
bedroom.
unit.
The granny, in your backyard. And accessible dwelling units are great. And California's most recently, permitted 25,000 of them in 2022. But California is a state of 40 million plus people. Or sorry, it's about 40 million now.
Sure.
25,000 units is a drop in the bucket. And so I think it's really important, if I were to say one thing, I would say that the YIMBY movement should not be patting itself on the back. The YIMBY movement should sort of think that they're just getting out of first gear. Because when you just look at the economic statistics of how much is getting built, the YIMBY movement has seen very, very little success to date. And so it's not that the legislative changes that have happened are bad. They're not bad. And there are a bunch of recent changes that I think we probably won't have time to get into. But, so California repealed for some larger developments. California repealed for some developments its environmental review procedures. There's recent pro-housing laws in Massachusetts and Washington where we haven't had time to see effects yet. So it's not that nothing ever could change, but nothing has changed yet. And we've been talking about this for more and more time, with plenty of think tank support, plenty of federal support, plenty of state legislators saying they're passing bills. You can't see it in the statistics test. You can't see it in California. You can't see it in New York. I'm not saying nothing will ever change, but it's really important to keep your eye on actually how many units of housing are getting built and not just what laws are getting passed and do we hope this new law will work. And when you just look at the number of housing units getting built, California is flatlined at a very low rate. New York has flatlined at a very low rate. There are places that are bright spots like Texas and Florida, but there's a lot of places where there's a lot of good jobs. And, it looks like the causal effect of Danny and I writing this paper was to keep housing supply low for another generation. I hope that's wrong.
I can blame you. Okay.
But that is what it looks like, is that no one's listening. And so that's why I said that this is sort of a Cassandra moment rather than an optimistic moment from my perspective.
Yoni, do you feel the same way? What does that tell us about the future of mobility in this country?
I'm at once more cynical and more optimistic than Peter. Let's take California as a good example, right? As early as the 19-teens, California invents single-family zoning, and the guy who invents it says essentially, like, the state is full. There's no more room here, right? At the time, there's 3.5 million people in California. Fast forward 50 years, and the population of California has grown to 20 million. It turned out there was more room in California. You could build denser. You could, right? Like, there's lots of space in California, and there's lots of opportunity for densification, and that's what happens. And the home prices don't go up. The median home price in California in 1970 is right at the median home price for the rest of the United States, right? So it's adding all this population without driving up home prices. Over the next 50 years, it goes from, instead of like quintupling the housing stock and the population, it goes from 20 million to 40 million. It only doubles it. And home prices in California today, a single family home is roughly twice the median in the United States, right? So the demand remains. They cease to increase the supply at anything like an adequate rate. And as a result, you end up with a situation in California where many more people want to live there than can afford to live there, and you get this skill sorting that Peter's talking about, where only the affluent get their slice of the California dream. That's who still moves in America. It's the well-educated and the well-paid. Um, but while it's absolutely the right target to ask, how many housing units is California actually adding, and 100,000 is a drop in the bucket. Like, it's not what California needs to be doing. I do think that there is an attitudinal change that I wouldn't underestimate. What happened in the 1970s didn't happen overnight, and it didn't just happen because of a set of regulatory changes. Americans came to think of growth as bad. They came to think of adding housing as something unattractive, as a penalty being imposed on neighbors, on communities, on the state. And that mentality, that giving people the right to join your community, giving them a place to live, allowing people to decide for themselves where they wanted to reside, was somehow bad. That undergirded a lot of the legal changes that we saw. It undergirded the rise in litigation. People felt virtuous if they were suing to block a new development.
Hmm.
That attitudinal change was really profound. I'm a big believer in the fact that I'm a big believer in the fact that political changes in this country tend to happen on a generational basis. It's really hard once somebody's dug in to get them to change their mind. But often younger generations will come up with a whole different set of views. And if you look at the polling now, that's what I think you'll see, is that Americans under the age of 40 who have grown up in a world where housing stock is much more constrained, where the opportunities are not available, where they have anecdotes like my anecdote or Peter's anecdote, or the anecdotes that I think many of the listeners could share. Those people have come to see adding housing as actually really good for their community. It adds diversity, it protects the environment, it doesn't harm it. It contributes to positive growth, to that larger pie from which they can extract their slice, and their neighbor can extract a slice too. Those attitudinal changes are going to take time to filter through. And Peter's right that we shouldn't take our eye off the ball. Simply having the attitudinal changes is not enough. But I am somewhat optimistic. It's a slow process of change. It does require the electorate shifting. But I think we've seen more and more mayors start to run campaigns around lowering the price of housing. I don't agree with all of their prescriptions necessarily, but it's becoming a potent political issue. It's becoming a national political issue. And so what started as the domain of think tanks and Washington economic staffers is rapidly becoming, I think, a much broader political issue that politicians of all stripe are going to take advantage of, apply a set of solutions that's widely varied in different places too, and we'll see what works and what does not. And when they do, I think they're going to be looking back at that paper, whether they know it or not. Their prioritization of housing will owe a lot to that broader understanding, that zooming out that Danny and Peter gave us in their paper.
Peter, does that help you with your Cassandraism at all?
I hope that Yoni's right and that I'm wrong. Time will tell.
All right. Well, thank you both for a terrific discussion. I'm going to shorten what is our usual lightning round and just ask each of you to answer this one question. Actually, Peter, you kind of did already, but we
That's
like
what you
to
get
ask
for
folks.
bringing a frequent listener on the program, Tess.
Exactly.
I can preempt your questions when I listen to enough episodes.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, so the question, Yoni, is if you had to make a pie with the current contents of your kitchen, what would it be? We've already heard from Peter. I think it's going to be blueberry, right? So how about you?
I've got a pumpkin rum pie that I really like making.
All right. And do you have pumpkins in your kitchen already?
I got the can.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, Yoni Appelbaum and Peter Ganong, thank you so much. This has been really thought-provoking, I think, and really appreciate you joining us for the pie today.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you
us.
so much.